Back at it again at the Krispy Kreme. Welcome back, mortals, to part 2 of my Slayers retrospective. Today we will be taking a look at the second season, Slayers Next, and how it compares to its previous season. If you missed the first video in the series, I absolutely recommend checking it out over here, and if you have seen it, thanks so much, I appreciate it. And now, without further ado, let's talk about Slayers Next. Airing in 1996, just a year after its predecessor, this season picks up pretty much exactly where the last one left off, with maybe a few months' time having gone by in-universe. Our party is currently separated, but that won't be for long, as we open on Gowry and Lena doing as they do best and fighting over inhuman amounts of food.
Out of my way! Ever hear of the word restraint, Lena?
Did you ever hear of ladies first?
The first episode of Next was always one of my favorites when I was younger because I feel like it completely encapsulated what Slayers as a whole is. It not only reintroduces us to our core cast in a fun way, but it also begins a trend within the Slayers canon that I think is one of its greatest strengths. And that is introducing new characters for the season to bounce off of our regulars and to keep the dynamic fresh. Because if you step back, pretty much every season of Slayers has the same through line. A new big bad is introduced, Lena has to use a super ultimate spell to destroy it, there's some fun filler episodes in the mix, and you wrap it all up with a banger of a Megumi Hayashibara song. But by adding new characters per season, you hardly notice, because the way they interact with the central duo of Lena and Gowry, and later Amelia and Zelgadis, as well, keeps things from getting bogged down like it might in a different anime. But rather than just explaining it in vague terms, let's zero in on the first episode and go over it together, and hopefully you'll see what I mean. So, we've started on Lena and Gowry fighting over food, an old gag to reel the audience back in and get them comfortable. The fight spills out into the streets to let us know little has changed in the small amount of time between seasons, as Lena is still predisposed to disproportionate displays of magic in response to minor inconveniences. The commotion leads into the appearance of Amelia, who has come to this town, the capital of the Kingdom of Zona, on a diplomatic mission. She reunites with Lena and Gowry briefly before making excuses to leave them behind, fearing that Lena would just cause problems during the negotiation process. A fear that is later proven correct, but we'll get there. For now, this intro's fantastic. It's simple, it's energetic, and it gives you a peek into how the party interacts when not being flung into dire circumstances. It is at this point that we meet the first of our new characters for the season, Martina, the princess of the Kingdom of Zona. And Martina's just great. She's this completely obsessive, stuck-up madwoman who is a perfect foil for Lena. As the series goes on, she continues to instigate so much of the comedy, either by prodding Lena's ego or by letting her own obsessive nature get the better of her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Alongside Martina and her make-believe patron, Zomulgustar, a monster she, to quote,
Zomulgustar is a name I made up myself!
We're also introduced to Zelgadis, who's been hired as a mercenary by the King of Zona to ensure the capture of Amelia, because there are no good kingdoms in Slayers except for Seirun, apparently. From here, it plays out as one might expect. The king is planning to betray and go to war with Seirun. Zelgadis reveals his motives to be trying to find the copy of a rare book to turn himself human, which he believes the king has. It's basically all fun and games until Lena shows up and does as Lena inverses want to do. Things come to a head when Martina uses a large Orichalcum golem to challenge the party, and the Kingdom of Zona is destroyed in classic Dragon Slave fashion. It literally has everything good about Slayers crammed into one episode while simultaneously being a perfect introduction to those who missed the previous season. Seriously, no joke. If you wanted to skip season 1 of Slayers and just start on Next, you could. Which isn't to say you should, just if someone's pressed for time and you can only show them one Slayer season, I'd probably pick Next. Which sounds really biased, because it is. Which means now would be as good a time as any to compare Next to the prior season. A lot of Next feels like it's building off of concepts and ideas from Season 1. The Lake Dragon episode is a spiritual successor to the theater troupe episode. The Consul and Mazenda arc is a serious take on Amelia's intro episode. Next doesn't just rehash plots from the previous season, it builds on their ideas and extrapolates them into a much more coherent plot, with the mystery of who's behind the rise in monster attacks and contracts being a background through line that builds into the season's conclusion. Although I will say, the Seirun arc was always my least favorite as a kid, and while I tried to give it a fair shake as an adult, I still found it to drag a bit in places. And I put most of that blame on the villains. Consul and Mazenda really don't have much personality beyond being fashion disasters, and the mastermind behind the plot, Alfred's motivations, are pretty bog standard, especially when compared to Halciform from the previous arc. I mean, sure, it's a little cliche, making a Faustian bargain to bring back your dead girlfriend, but it still carries more emotional weight than, I want to be king of this kingdom the story tells you is important, but doesn't actually do much in the grand scheme of things. Like, at the end of the season, if Seirun's assistance was integral to defeating Gav or Fabrizzo, the season's final villains, sure, this arc would make more sense, because you'd be sitting there going, dang, I'm sure glad they stopped Alfred, otherwise Seirun wouldn't have been here to help our heroes, and they would have been so fucked. But that's not the case, and it has been and continues to be a minor miss in an otherwise great season for me. Another low point in the season would have to be the questionably drawn mooks from episode 14. Yeah. Listen, I'm certainly not excusing anything, but 90s anime really only liked two things: mystifying South American culture and drawing black and black-coded characters inappropriately. It's not great, but it's also not my lane, so I leave this up to you, the viewer, as to how comfortable you are engaging with this season based on that. But if these guys aren't a deal breaker, then otherwise this season has some of the best filler I've seen in any anime ever. And hey, at least they gave the Ranma rejects from the same episode Valley Girl voices instead of whatever the fuck Robot Carnival was doing.
Hold on! What do you think you're doing?
What's wrong?
All you've done so far is destroy half the buildings in that neighborhood!
Either way, you kids these days are spoiled. Back in my day, we had to sit through a whole filler episode worth of shenanigans to get one idol performance. Now you just turn on your crunchy rolls and there's Love Live. But other than that, the filler's great. These days, I think filler's become something of a dirty word, evoking images of either questionable fan service or episodes that take away from the plot's already short runtime, much to the chagrin of manga fans everywhere. However, in the case of Slayers, the filler is more in line with what filler used to be, before the great Naruto filler arc. Opportunities to put your favorite characters in lighthearted situations outside the main storyline. As I mentioned in the previous video, they're a great breather between more serious storylines, and they let you get to know the cast a bit better as people when they're not dragon slaving their way through the continent. My favorite of which from Next probably being the Battle of Arteme Tower. It's completely silly and still tons of fun to watch. The best one character-wise, though, is probably they're talking about a girl named Zelgadis. Yes, it's officially the 17th episode of the season, time to put Gowry in Sailor Moon hair. The basic premise of this episode is that there is a holy city where only women are allowed to enter. Men are put to death if they trespass, and the party's pretty sure the item they're seeking is there, so there really is only one solution. Let just the women party members go ahead to gather info and see if their claims are legit. No. Drag.
Well, come in. Poopy butt.
And while that's a plenty zany premise, there's an interesting emotional core to this episode that was severely lacking in last season's cross-dressing episode, and that is Zelgadis and Miwan. Miwan being the princess of the holy city of Famil, yes, really, who feels at odds with the life forced upon them by their mother and is seeking to escape the city to live freely and true to themselves. We see this really resonate with Zelgadis, who quickly forms an attachment to Miwan. because Zelgadis knows what it feels like to be trapped in his own body. And then Miwon is revealed to be a man by the end of the episode. Yup, raised to behave and perform femininity by his mother, Miwon's true desire was to live truthfully as a man. And while this is used as a bit of a punchline, alongside most of, if not all of the city being revealed to be men as well, a funnier reveal in my opinion, I do think the genuine character moments are sweet and interesting. A much gentler touch than last season's Some Like It Hot style of humor.
But you don't understand, Osgood. I'm a man. Well, nobody's perfect.
Like, rather than tormenting Gowry with a case of the not gays, the real humor to me comes from this kingdom lauding its shrine maidens and gender exclusivity, despite the fact that it clearly never mattered given the sheer number of dudes by the end. It still isn't exactly perfect, but it still feels like an improvement overall. Which again, is what Next feels like. Imperfect, sure, but an improvement. Another great example would be the choice to have the party searching for an item rather than going to a location. It keeps the plot moving more seamlessly, and it leads to smaller arcs surrounding the search for said item, which feels more like a road trip and helps the stakes raise at a more even pace. It still has that D&D flavor, but it all comes together to feel more like it's grown into its own show, rather than just recounting someone's campaign. Whereas the previous season, you basically had go here, fight Shabernigdo, filler arc, go here, fight Copy Rezo. Now it's, we would like to find the Clare Bible. Maybe it's here. No? Well then, on to the next place until all of these little hints of something bigger come to a head. And what a finale it is. All throughout the season, there were these little tidbits that something larger was happening outside our heroes, and once the party is actually dragged into it and finds what they're looking for, the aforementioned Clare Bible, which contains all the wisdom of a dead god, it's a whole thing, the true villains of the story are pulled to the forefront, revealing that Lena and the gang had been inadvertently pulled into a power struggle between two very powerful demon lords, one wanting to conquer the world, and another wanting to destroy it. And this is going back to something the first season did really well, the world building. Yet again, at the season's conclusion, we're introduced to names we'd heard in passing or in the name of spells, the Water Dragon God and Gov now appearing as actual plot-relevant characters. And it's something that will continue all the way into the third season.
Even a human wielding the sword of Gornova is no match for me.
We'll get there. And I have to say, even though this season's finale takes place in Cyrag as well, it feels much more dire than the first season's ending. Hellmaster is a much more threatening nemesis than Copy Rezo. And part of that is that Fabrizio is a far less sympathetic character, but also that he's willing and able to do much more heinous things than Rezo's clone, like animating the souls of Cyrag's dead to distract and torment our heroes, and they're fully aware they're dead. Dude, that's pretty evil. So what is one to do? Everyone's dead. The literal Lord of Hell is leveraging your friend's souls against you and demanding you cast a spell that is likely to destroy the world in order to destroy the world. Well, in Lena's case, she casts it. The Giga Slave, used in the first season to destroy Shabernigdo, now revealed to be a conduit to the ultimate power in the Slayer's universe, the Lord of Nightmares. But not just a conduit, as she says, she's the spell herself.
My mind is my power. Power is my mind. When uncorrupted by other elements, my mind becomes my purest power.
She is another interesting piece of Slayer's cosmology. Basically serving as the god of the Slayer's world, she is a powerful being of chaos that created the world, with her true form being a sea of chaos as described in the incantation for the Gigaslave, a formless dark expanse upon which the rest of the planes of the Slayer's cosmology rest. Which includes the world the sci-fi spin-off series Lost Universe takes place in, but only in the anime version. It's confusing, but maybe I'll talk about it in another video. What's interesting about not just The Lord of Nightmares, but the ending of Slayers Next in general, is that it almost has what you might call final act syndrome, a term coined by Bennett the Sage of Anime Abandon to describe a lighthearted anime that turns dour and dark in the last act of the show. I mean, the world's ending, crumbling around everyone, the main cast just barely escaped their death, the main character has been taken over by the god of all gods. It's a far cry from Battle Tennis, just a few episodes earlier. However, what I think sets Slayers apart is that the tone shift starts right at the end of the second act and mirrors the dire feeling of the previous season, so it doesn't come completely out of nowhere. Instead, it follows a more traditional narrative ending structure you might see in American fantasy films of the 80s, having a dark hour, or dark night of the soul, just before the power of love is able to overcome any obstacle and win the day. I mentioned in my previous video that Slayers was wholly intimate with the trappings of Western fantasy stories, and while the brief Gowry mind control arc has more to do with Sentai tropes in my opinion, the bubbly feel-good romance ending seems ripped right out of things like Legend or Willow, which are all things that are just as nostalgic to me as Slayers. I must admit I can see this being a detriment to anyone who didn't grow up alongside the dinosaurs. Without the touchstones of the time to reinforce what the anime is going for, this show may not resonate quite as well. But I would still hope it could be enjoyable, even for newcomers to the series. To conclude, this is the most sentimental season for me, and while it may not be as cohesive as the season after it, in my opinion, I would have to dub this the quintessential season of Slayers, with the best parts of both the first and third seasons combined. It reminds me of a bit of wisdom a friend gave to me about tattoos, which was, don't stress yourself out over the design of your tattoo. Instead, focus on the person you were when you got it. Sure, maybe you won't like the subject matter as much with time, but you can still look back on where you were as a person and remember that fondly. Which I have found to be entirely true. I have a couple tattoos myself in real life. My first one is of a subject I'm not as connected to as I was at the time, but I can never regret it, because every time I see it, I don't just think of the design itself, I think of what I was doing then, all the fun shops and cafes I went to with friends, warm evenings in bars, shooting the shit, and just enjoying life. And that's kind of what Slayers Next is for me. It's still my favorite, not necessarily for its content, but because of who I was when I first watched it. Of my friends and I scouring the internet for any information about the show, trading tidbits and fanfics and music like precious sacred things, of pooling our allowances together to buy overpriced box sets that we would share custody of like divorcee children. I can never experience Slayers Next the same way ever again. But when I do watch it, it brings forth nothing but treasured memories. And I hope you all out there have an anime like that as well. Heck, if you want to tell me about it, do it. Please tell me about it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Anyway, thanks for watching, mortals. Take care of yourself, take care of each other. If you like this video and want to see more, feel free to subscribe or toll the little bell. Ave Satanis. And remember, cringe is dead. Long live cringe.